Hello and welcome to Ideas Having Sex with Chris Kaufman. I'm Chris Kaufman, and each show I bring to you an interesting and provocative scholar to discuss topics in social science, philosophy, history, politics, and more. If you enjoy what I do, please take a minute to subscribe to the show and to give us a rating and review wherever you listen. Hey everybody, and welcome to Ideas Having Sex. I'm Chris Kaufman, and today I am joined by Tibor Rutar. Tibor is a professor of sociology at the University of Maribor, Slovenia. He is the author of Rational Choice and Democratic Government, but his latest book, which we are talking about today, is Capitalism for Realists, Virtues and Vices of the Modern Economy. Tibor, thank you for joining me.
Hi, Chris. It's awesome to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. I know you wanted to say something about your background and how you came to write this book. So I guess that's my first question. How did you come to write this book? What was your journey? Did this start in graduate school? Has this been turning around in your head for a long time? How did you come to publish this?
Sure, let's get into it. So I was actually a very committed Marxist, both politically and intellectually, 10 years ago as I was finishing up my undergraduate studies. This was in the aftermath of the great financial recession and the Occupy movement, and I just got radicalized. There was a local student strike or a student sit-in at the Faculty of Arts, and one thing led to another. So I read the first volume of Marx's Capital and a few works by contemporary Marxist economists like Andrew Kleiman. His book, The Failure of Capitalist Production, made a great impression on me back in 2012. And so I basically joined the local Marxist reading group. That ballooned after a while. We even got the opportunity to invite many Marxists across the world, from the United States, from Britain, from France, to come to Slovenia to give some talks, to join us at our annual May Day conference. I joined a budding socialist political party that is right now, I exited it later on, but right now it's actually a part of the ruling coalitionary government. And so I decided to do my PhD and master's on Marxism, on Marxist economics, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, Marxist historical sociology, trying to defend it against criticisms coming out of the more postmodern and Weberian sociological perspectives. And I decided to be a Marxist. I wrote many articles from a Marxist perspective. And then around 2017, so 5-6 years ago, I started moving slowly away from Marxism because I got interested in philosophy of science. And to my mind, at least, Marxists didn't say that much useful stuff on that. So I read up on classics like Karl Popper and Thomas Kuhn and Paul Feyerabend. And I just slowly moved away from Marxism. But the real trigger for me, the real point of deconversion, I guess, came in the summer of 2018 when I read two books by non-Marxist political economists. One was the book by Jason Brennan, your former guest, Against Democracy, and the other book was by Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson, Why Nations Fail. And I was struck by two things as I was reading those books. First of all, how convinced I was by most of their arguments. And then secondly, reflecting on that fact, I realized that basically this was not surprising because my own brand of Marxism was always kind of peculiar. I was usually more in line with the analytical Marxists like John Romer and Eric Olin Wright, people like that. And I discovered that actually all this time as a Marxist, I was doing a rational choice analysis just from a more constrained class struggle perspective. I was focused on the economic side of life and trying to deduce all the interesting social phenomena from how the exploiters behaved in their relationship to the exploited. And then reading Why Nations Fail and Against Democracy, I realized, well, why not just use rational choice theory as I have been doing all this time, but not constrain myself just by focusing on class struggle. And I guess Acemoglu and Brennan showed me the way. So this is how I came to write this book. A few years later, I was now reading up on public choice theory, on institutional economics. I read a few textbooks on neoclassical economics as I was kind of free from my Marxist constraints. And I realized that I have a kind of deep knowledge of both of these sides of the debate. So I knew a lot about Marxism, or the analytical flavor of Marxism. And then I knew a lot about public choice and more libertarian, I guess, perspectives, more mainstream perspectives. And I realized that there's so much common ground in actuality when you strip away all the political rhetoric between, say, analytical Marxism and public choice, that I decided to write a book trying to synthesize those perspectives, and also maybe to try to write a book that is not burdened by trying to create this grand defense or grand critique, theoretical critique of capitalism. And I try to write a book that would let the facts, descriptive facts, and inferential statistics to speak for itself as much as it can.
You mentioned a phrase in there, analytical Marxism, which comes up a lot in the book. Can you say something about what analytical Marxism is and how it's distinct from classical Marxism or other brands of Marxism?
Sure. So analytical Marxism was in its heyday in the late 70s and through the 80s and maybe early 90s. And then in the past 2 decades, it went into a bit of a decline. This was basically a research program within the broad Marxist tradition, which set itself 2 tasks to achieve. First of all, analytical Marxists tried to renew or rework the classical Marxist theses and conclusions and arguments with a modern social scientific outlook in mind. So using the tools of analytical philosophy, like being clear with your definitions, making precise distinctions, trying to be as transparent as possible when you're arguing and laying out your causal chains or conceptual chains. And also by applying game theory and rational choice theory and such assumptions like methodological individualism, and try to rework Marxism in that way. And then secondly, to test all of those claims when they're reworked, which of those can stand up to empirical investigation using mathematics and statistics and even qualitative historical data. And what they found, these analytical Marxists, people like Herbert Gintis and, like I mentioned, Eric Olin Wright, John Romer, John Elster, what they found out was that, well, some of those claims of classical Marxism can be reframed in a modern scientific way, but some of them cannot be. And of those that can be reframed, some of them don't really stand up to empirical scrutiny. And of those that do stand up to empirical scrutiny, most of them are not really distinctively Marxist. So you can make various claims that Marxists would like that capitalism has a tendency to drive up inequalities, that capitalism has a tendency to exploit workers to a certain extent, that political elites under capitalism government are usually captured by special interests. All of those Marxism's claims can be made in a modern scientific framework, but those are not really distinctively Marxist. I mean, libertarians make those claims, at least some of them. Public choice theorists, institutional economists make those claims. So analytical Marxism could be summed up by what I think John Elster once said, and that is that most of the things that are analytical in Marxism are not really distinctively Marxist, and most of distinctively Marxist claims don't really stand up to analytical and empirical scrutiny in the modern context.
Okay, thank you. So this is how you came to write the book. Just broadly, because we'll get into the specifics more as we go, what's the thesis of the book?
Yeah, the broad thesis of the book is that capitalism has, like the subtitle says, many virtues and also many vices, and that trying to divide ourselves into the more left-leaning Marxist camp and the more, let's say, right-leaning libertarian camp, I don't think is all that opposite when we try to evaluate capitalism in a realistic fashion. We should simply admit from the start that capitalism has its downsides and its upsides, and then we should analyze that theoretically in the most neutral way possible. So no special pleading, no assumptions that capitalists are inherently evil or selfish while workers are not, or voters and ostensibly government planners and bureaucrats would like to pursue the public interest. None of that things. Just use the basic tools of rational choice analysis and then let the empirical data speak for themselves, in which aspects capitalism is a superior or at least a semi-optimal system, and in which aspects it could be improved upon by certain economic and political reforms, like maybe making it more social democratic, maybe establishing a universal basic income, maybe having stronger unions if there is actually some degree of exploitation. I would just I wouldn't start with certain presumptions about labor unions, about, let's say, the welfare state. I would just try to see where the evidence leads us. And theoretically, I would use as bare bones a theory as possible.
Okay. So the book is called Capitalism for Realists. There's two big terms there. Just take them one at a time. How are you defining capitalism in this book? And what do you mean by realists? And how is that like as opposed to idealists, or do you have something else in mind there?
Sure. Capitalism is a system, at the most basic level, is a system that involves security of property rights, private ownership of the means of production, and both widespread market competition and market dependence. With that, I simply mean that a society is capitalist if in it people are not afraid that their property is going to get expropriated away overnight, if the majority of the productive assets like offices and buildings and factories, firms, in general, corporations are in private hands, not owned by a collective body like the government. And with market dependence, I mean that the majority of economic actors can only renew their own social position, can maintain themselves in their structural position if they consistently get involved in market exchange. Capitalists stop being capitalists if they stop going to the market, and the same goes for workers. They have to keep on reselling their labor power. They have to go to the job because otherwise they won't get any wages in return, and so they won't be workers. They won't be able to maintain their social position. And then lastly, with market competition, I simply mean that there have to be loads of buyers and sellers of goods, services, labor power, not too many monopolies. There has to be relative ease of entrance into the market for potential new entrants. So that would be capitalism. And then we could talk maybe later about whether this definition is the right one, or maybe other definitions are superior. That's usually a problematic discussion because definitions are tautologies. They can be correct or wrong. They just are, and maybe they're more or less useful, but you can't empirically test a definition. I have a way to solve that problem and to try to assert that my definition is the one that is most useful, but maybe we get to that later on. And then about realists, well, with that, I mean, perhaps I mean two things which I've slightly mentioned before. So the first thing is that let's theoretically speaking, if we are realists, theoretically speaking, let's be as bare bones as possible. None of these grand theoretical defenses or critiques of capitalism. In Marxism, for example, there's all this talk about dialectics, about reification, about false consciousness, all these complex theoretical apparatuses. And I think most of that is fluff. It's either incoherent or it's fluff. You don't need that. And libertarians, for their part, sometimes also get bogged down in these grand philosophical defenses of individual liberties and so on, trying to be deontologists where you cannot violate property rights of anybody, even if your own life depends on that. And I would just do away with that if we are being realists and just use rational choice theory. Let's just suppose people are rational, they're strategizing, they're responsive to incentives, and they want to do the best they can for themselves and their family. And then let's try to see where that assumption leads us within a given system, like capitalism or the basic structures of which I've just laid out. Let's see if in such a system, over the long term, people will be cronies, whether they'll be corrupt, whether the general social welfare will be protected, to what extent, and so on. And then the second thing, and this is more empirically speaking now, is let's just try to look at the best studies, quantitative, qualitative, and other studies that we have on various topics. Let's see what are the correlates of social inequality, I mean income and wealth inequality. Let's try to examine whether realistic markets as they exist in reality, not on paper, in perfectly competitive Econ 101 models, whether they engender exploitation or not. How would you measure that? Is that reliable or not? Stuff like that.
Okay. I'm perfectly happy with the definition you gave. That sounds reasonable to me and how I think about the term capitalism. But I'm curious, coming from a Marxist background, is your sense that that is the way Marxists think about capitalism? Because there's a talking past each other I've seen in a lot of debates between more libertarian and more Marxist people, where people with Marxist leanings tend to think of the distinctive feature of capitalism as workers being dependent on bosses. or something like that, that like the market per se, or free markets, is not really the distinctive feature of capitalism. And whereas I think defenders of capitalism often do think of secure property rights and free markets as being kind of the sine qua non, and Marxists thinking more of this kind of unequal economic arrangement where you have capitalist bosses with most of the property and large numbers of wage earning workers. So that if you had a free market with private property that was almost entirely made up of small independent contractors, that maybe wouldn't count as capitalism on the Marxist side, but would on the libertarian side. Does that ring true to you at all? Am I on to anything there?
Sure. Definitely, you definitely are. So yeah, there's a part of this debate that definitely goes down in the way that you described it now. So Marxists definitely emphasize the enclosure movement in England in the transition to capitalism, how the landholding peasantry was at one point expropriated by violent means. And so these people became landless laborers who could then be exploited by capitalists. I guess that this is covered in my definition with the clause referring to the private ownership of the means of production. But you're right that this could be in tension when it comes to some Marxists. I guess that, and this is a funny thing about my past as well now, I guess the Marxists that mostly influenced me, like Alan Meiksins Wood, like Robert Brenner, the historian Robert Brenner, all of them were very adamant from the start. Even Andrew Kleiman, the Marxist economist I mentioned at the start, all of them were adamant that capitalism in itself has nothing specifically to do with markets per se. Markets have to be competitive. And yes, like you said, there has to exist a relationship of dependence. Some people that are property owning and others that are not. When these Marxists talked about capitalism, they defined it in a weird roundabout way. So what they said is, let's first look at what are the typical consequences of capitalism, what libertarians and Marxists would agree upon. And that is, usually we say that in capitalism you have a constant self-sustaining modern economic growth, so constant increases in GDP per capita, year over year, decade over decade, century over century, obsession with growth, maybe some Marxists would put it. Secondly, we have constantly increasing labor productivity. And lastly, all of this happens because there is a constant process of cutting costs in the production process, of introducing labor-saving machinery in the production process, and of constantly innovating technologically. So this is what my Marxists taught me, that all of this is what usually results from capitalism. And then they said, now just ask yourself, Tibor or Chris, just ask yourself, what should the basic economic structures or institutions in a society be like, so that the people in a society would behave in such a way to bring about those economic consequences of constantly increasing labor productivity and GDP per capita and constantly innovating technologically? And their answer would be competition. You need competition. Before, when markets were not competitive, merchants were selling by using the age-old principle of buying cheap to sell dear. That is the obverse of competition. Competition erodes such super profits or extra profits. So you need competition. And yes, like you said, Chris, you need this relationship of dependence. You need a mass of landless laborers who could be employed by the bosses and who could be made to work with improved machinery and who could be made to work with higher labor productivity.
Okay. So later in the book, you look at a lot of contemporary empirical studies, but you also spend a decent amount of time talking about the historical origins of capitalism. And that's a big topic. And there is a large literature trying to tease out the causes of, well, we're going to make some distinctions between the Industrial Revolution per se and capitalism, or the Great Enrichment, or whatever you want to call it. But the cause of whatever it was that led to large growth in wealth sometime initially in the 1750s in England and the Netherlands, and expanding around the world slowly thereafter. So can you say a little bit about what main scholars you draw on and where you come down on that question of what initially caused capitalism and or the Industrial Revolution, and what's the difference between those things?
Yeah, sure. I guess one holdover from my Marxist past is that I'm still quite a materialist a scholar, or somebody who looks at material causes of various phenomena. And I'm not all that at ease with cultural explanations, although this is changing now that I've discovered, it has been changing for a few years, that I've discovered cultural evolutionary theory, the works of people like Joseph Henrich and people like that. So, like you said, maybe we should make a distinction between explanations that draw more on the material, potential material causes of the transition, and those that deal more with cultural or ideational factors. And here I would say that in the materialist camp, the most influential scholar for me was Robert Brenner, the Marxist I already mentioned, and other people around him, like the historian Christopher Dyer and the Marxist historian Spencer Dimmock, people like that. And then in the culturalist camp, I guess we can't do anything else but to mention great scholars such as Joseph Henrich, who says that the Roman Catholic Church, with its strictures about the family life and kinship structures, caused the transition to modernity and capitalism and the markets and all the rest of it. And Joel Mokyr, who argues that the Enlightenment movement was the main reason for at least the Industrial Revolution, if not the commercial revolution or the emergence of capitalism itself. And then you also have, maybe on the materialist side, you have Robert Allen. Robert Allen is one of the foremost historians of the Industrial Revolution, and he has some disagreements with the guy who mostly influenced me, so Robert Brenner. So these are the contours. Maybe because I in the book I deal with both of these camps. I am affirmatively in the materialist camp, and I critique Henrich and Mokyr and other culturalists. Maybe I could start with them first. So Joseph Henrich has this story about how between 500 AD and 1500 AD, the church suddenly, for reasons that are not important, decided to ban cousin marriages, to enforce monogamy where there was only polygyny before in Europe, and to try to encourage neolocality, so neolocal residences. That means that when young couples marry and get together, they move away from their parents to a different village, definitely set up their own separate household. And he says that these normative strictures that started in the 6th century AD, that they led to a wholly new social environment in which people of Europe found themselves in. So after a few centuries, they now were in different villages. They have severed connections with their extended kinship networks, and they were facing total strangers in their daily lives. And if they wanted to get on with their life, they had to be seen as trustworthy, and they had to trust others. They had to cooperate with strangers, no longer just rely on their own families. And they had to trade with people. They had to set up voluntary associations. And all of that, Henrich says, over the millennium between the 6th and the 16th century, led to the emergence of modernity. So individualism, generalized fairness, generalized trust, all of these cultural correlates of modernity, and all of those were then responsible for the efflorescence of trade, for the booming of voluntary associations, for the rise of parliaments, for the struggle for representation, democracy, and all of that. Now, Joel Mokyr has a different emphasis. He says that the Enlightenment movement of the 16th, or the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th century, and then the Enlightenment movement and the Republic of Letters of the 17th and 18th century, all of that created a propitious ideational environment for scientific experimentation, for intellectual innovation, and all of that enabled especially people in England to apply all of these scientific breakthroughs to production, so that they could expel labor from production, so they could set up factories, use steam power, and simply unleash industrial revolution. Now, maybe you want me to say something about why I disagree with them before moving on to my explanation. How would you like to go about that?
Yeah, I'd love that, because I have read summaries of, in some cases, and the actual work in some cases of some of these scholars, and I have not landed anywhere in particular. And I've spoken to several authors on the show, who do have opinions about this, and I think it's a super important and very interesting topic. So yeah, I'd love to hear your critiques and why you disagree with the cultural explanations.
Sure. I mean, they're all impressive scholars, both
mostly
Mokyr
disagree, or whatever you want to say. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, exactly. So I'm quite convinced by the statistical evidence that especially Henrik marshals in his book, when he argues that, for example, if you look at various correlations, you can see quite clearly that the length of the exposure to church in Europe, especially Western Europe, places like Germany and France and England, the length of the church's exposure correlates quite strongly with the kinship intensity index. The longer that you were under the influence of the church, the lower today the kinship intensity index in your countries, and the lesser the prevalence of cousin marriages is. So obviously the church did something right when it was efficacious when it banned all of those normative practices. And secondly, he also draws our attention to the fact that these various correlates of modernity, normative correlates of modernity, like generalized trust, generalized fairness, individualism, non-conformity, all of those show up in places where the church was mostly present, in places where kinship networks, the family, in a way, was destroyed or dismantled in comparison to what came before. So that is convincing to me. But the biggest hang-up I have is that his story is, we could call it pan-Western European. It applies to the whole of Western Europe because all of those places had a similar, I think, 8th or 9th century long exposure to the church. And the issue I have, and that I show in my book, is that only England was special between 1500 AD and 1800 AD. Only in England do we see the takeoff of self-sustaining modern economic growth. From late 16th, early 17th century on, you see constant increases in labor productivity in England, but not in the Netherlands, definitely not in France, Germany, Austria, Italy, Spain, Portugal. Only in England do you see, after centuries of stagnation of GDP per capita, sudden increases, year-on-year increases in GDP per capita. That doesn't happen in Italy. It doesn't happen in the Netherlands. It doesn't happen in France, Germany, between 1500 and 1800 AD, so after the Middle Ages. And if you look at urbanization rates, again, what you see is that England was a backwater, or urban backwater, before the end of the Middle Ages. I think that the urbanization rate was 3%. And then in mere 3 centuries, up till 1800s, it went to more than 20%, so a 7-fold increase, while France and Germany, for example, which were at around 4 to 5% of urbanization rate in the end of the Middle Ages, so 1500 AD, they only moved up a few percentage points, well under 10%. In those 3 centuries, which is roughly in line with China and India, which Henrik would definitely not claim that were on their way to modernity because they were not under the influence of the Roman Catholic Church. So the fact that you had this special occurrence in England, and then later on, of course, the Industrial Revolution comes about in England, not in the Netherlands, not in Germany, Italy, all of that makes me doubtful of his claim. There's also the issue that other aspects of modernity, like democracy, democratic representation, that comes 4 centuries after most of the work done by Henrik's thesis is accomplished. So in the late 19th, early 20th century, while he claims that the rise of parliaments and democratic representation should already start occurring between 1500 and 1800. And this is the similar issue I have with Joel Mokir's thesis. Definitely the Enlightenment had some influence on the Industrial Revolution and the emergence of modernity, but the fact that the Enlightenment movement was very strongly present both in England and in the Netherlands and France and Germany and Italy, Mokir himself says that many of the inventions that were applied to production in England during the Industrial Revolution actually originated from France. So the fact that England was special, but the Enlightenment movement was present all over the place in Western Europe, that makes me think that there has to be more.
I want to ask a question about the distinction between materialist and idealist explanations of this kind of thing. So when Marxists talk about being materialist, we're not talking about physics and the physical world. We're talking about explanations for large social changes originating in the material realities and often the economic material realities of the world. So like, for instance, maybe some major technological change, like the advent of electricity or something like that. Would that be a good like materialist causal example of why a change might have hurt? Not that it necessarily is a major Marxist example, but that kind of thing. Whereas these cultural explanations would be more in the idealist camp.
But that is especially a classical Marxist example of being a materialist, definitely referring to trying to deduce various social changes from technological improvement. Definitely, yeah.
Okay. And so that's a relevant distinction. And you're saying you're coming from the Marxist tradition that you've mostly shed, but you still are more persuaded by some of the more materialist explanations or at least a little bit more skeptical of people like Joel McKeer and Heinrich who are offering idealist and cultural explanations. My question is, political institutional causes, is that traditionally thought of as fitting more in the materialist or more in the idealist explanation?
Yeah, there's a bit of a controversy about that, and I should be more clear. You're right about what does it even mean when I say that I'm more a materialist scholar. So I usually don't refer to technological change like Marxists do, and they would probably not call me a materialist. I am a materialist in the sense that I try to when it comes to these grand social transformations, like the movement from feudalism to capitalism, I try to deduce those, at least ultimately, and not in a proximate, but in an ultimate sense. I try to deduce them from the economic interests and economic power relations and economic institutions and changes in economic institutions between people. So a materialist in that sense, a materialist in the sense of rational choice theory, I would guess.
Okay, so now you've said something about the scholars offering cultural explanations and some of your critique there. You want to say something about the different scholars offering a more materialist explanation as well as your particular explanation, which I don't know, to what extent it's original and to what extent it's a synthesis. Maybe you could say something about that.
Sure, that's perfect. That's perfect. Yeah, let's maybe start with Robert Allen, because he's the most famous of the bunch. So Allen's explanation at the proximate level for the Industrial Revolution is that you had this lopsided relationship between the price of labor and the price of capital. Workers were kind of pricey. They were expensive in England in comparison to the rest of Europe in the 17th and 18th century preceding the Industrial Revolution. And you also had access to cheap energy in England, but not elsewhere. And he says that it would be beneficial for businessmen to try to introduce labor-saving technology in the production process because workers were so expensive. You try to shed those workers, and that then led for him to the Industrial Revolution. It was a sort of a way to deal with the problem of expensive workers, to try to reduce your cost as a businessman. And then he says that to understand why that was the case, you have to look at the preceding centuries, so centuries between the 15th or 16th and 19th century, between 1500 and 1800 AD. And he says that there were some special things occurring in England back then. That is, first of all, England had a large internal domestic market. Secondly, labor productivity, like I already mentioned, was constantly increasing, even back then, before the Industrial Revolution. And then lastly, you had a consumerist revolution. So many people in England started buying their basic foodstuffs and other necessities that they needed on the market instead of growing them themselves on their own land, like peasants would in France or even in Italy and Germany. And so he says that because of all those factors, workers were pricey. There was a high demand for workers because a market, the general consumer market was quite large in England. Everybody was buying stuff. You needed to produce that stuff. To produce that stuff, you needed to employ workers in your shops. And that's why, because of the high demand for labor, workers were pricey, and that then led to the Industrial Revolution. But then to explain why that was the case, why England was so different between 1500 and 1800 AD in these aspects, I think you would then have to go to quote unquote my explanation, which I actually borrow from Robert Brenner and Christopher Dyer. And that is, you should look at what happened in the centuries preceding all of those phenomena. So before the end of the Middle Ages, in the late 14th and throughout the 15th century. And what happened there is that you had the plague pandemic that hit the whole of Europe, including England, and it killed off 1/3 to 1/2 of everybody. And in England, especially, the English landlords were now faced with a revenue crisis, especially because in the aftermath of the plague, the bargaining position of peasants in England was increased because they were now such a rare commodity, and they managed to struggle for the abolition of serfdom. They abolished serfdom, which was basically a semi-slave-holding institution, and the English landlords were now in a pickle because they couldn't get the surpluses that they could get before the pandemic. And so they had two options how to address that crisis. One option was what happened in the continent with their French counterparts. In France, landlords tried to address their revenue crisis by joining and building up the absolutist tax office state. The serfdom was also abolished in France, and they tried to get around that problem by using the institution of taxation and the king's military to extort freeholding peasants. In England, that was not on the table for various historical reasons that have to do with the fact, with the manner in which the Norman conquest of the 11th century proceeded, but we can leave that for some other time. And so the second option in England was for these landlords to try to get rid of their large land holdings, which amounted to 1/3 of the best land in England. There was so much land in the private hands of English landlords, much more than in France, for example. So these English landlords tried to now get rid of that land because it was left unworked by the serfs, because some of them died off, and in the end, serfdom was abolished. And they decided to lease it out, to rent it out to wealthier peasants called yeomen. And Robert Allen has spoken about the rise of the yeoman farmer and how important that was for the capitalist transition before the Industrial Revolution in England. And when they did that, here we are really talking about a lot of land, hundreds of acres of land per individual landlord. When these wealthier peasants went from farming 20 to 30 acres to farming hundreds of acres of land, they suddenly got the incentive to specialize in the production of a single crop that they could produce as efficiently as possible, and that they could then sell on the market to get some money in return, and then buy everything that they needed for their livelihood on the market instead of growing it themselves on their subsistence farms. So here you have a movement towards Smithian growth because of this transference of land from landlords to wealthier peasants. More importantly, perhaps, the landlords instituted temporary contracts. They would this land that got into the hands of yeomen would be back on the market in a few years. So the yeomen, the wealthier peasants, now had a strong incentive to try to compete against each other on the market for agricultural products. They try to be as efficient as possible. They try to introduce technological innovations in the production process to accumulate as much of surplus as possible so that they could repay the rent at the end of the term, and they could get another contract. So that movement, that emerging competition on the market for agricultural product, that was the unintended consequences of the English landlords trying to simply maintain themselves as they were in the light of the revenue crisis that was caused by the pandemic, given the context of England, which was very different from France. All of that, I think, caused the agricultural revolution between the 16th and 18th century, all of that Alan talks about. And that was then responsible for the consumerist revolution, and that was then in turn responsible for the industrial revolution.
You said agricultural revolution a second ago. Did you mean industrial?
No, agricultural, actually. No, yeah.
So like the revolution in the way they were conducting their agriculture.
Yeah, got it. Sometimes it's called the agrarian capitalist revolution. Sometimes it's called the second agricultural revolution.
Got you. So we've got capitalism established. And then now in subsequent chapters, you go through a variety of potential issues or shortcomings or areas of critique that people might have of capitalism and try to come at it using this rational choice model and looking at the empirical evidence and come to a balanced assessment of what the evidence is. You do a great job describing and summarizing dozens and dozens of studies and what they say on balance. So maybe we don't have to hit all of them, but one of the things you take on is exploitation. How does capitalism fare with regard to exploitation? Good topic for you to take on, coming from a Marxist perspective. So firstly, what is the initial classical Marxist view of what exploitation is? How has that changed over time? And how are you talking about exploitation ultimately in this book?
Yeah, so Marxists have had weird thoughts about exploitation, defining it and then trying to explain why it happens. I'm not on board with all of that, but I would say that a pragmatic definition of exploitation that even Marxists could accept, and I think libertarians could as well, simply involves two characteristics. First of all, there has to be some unequal exchange of something going on between two parties. Somebody has to, for example, perform some work for somebody else that amounts to a value of X dollars. And then somebody has to give that guy something in return for that, let's say some wages that amount to some other amount of dollars that are different from the work that has been performed. And somebody has to lose out from that. So a non-reciprocal exchange has to happen. And then secondly, and very much importantly, I think that this has to happen not just because somebody voluntarily decided to gift somebody something without expecting anything in return or without expecting equal remuneration in return, but there has to be some vulnerable position that was that one of the parties was in, and that one of the parties acceded to the unequal exchange because of that vulnerable position. So that would be, I guess, exploitation. The classical example that we don't have to go into is the guy falls in the pit, in a hole, and then somebody else comes along and offers him a rope to get him out, but he also says that I'll only get you out of the hole if you offer to give me half of your wage till the rest of your life. That's a sort of an unequal exchange, and the guy accepted that only because he was in a vulnerable position. And that definition also, by the way, allows for exploitation to be a positive sum game, which Marxists sometimes deny, but I think we should affirm. Exploitation, when it occurs, usually it's a positive sum game, and that's why workers voluntarily accept to being exploited, because it's better than the alternative. That is, it's better to be exploited under capitalism than not be exploited at all, not being employed at all. So that's exploitation. Now, of course, somebody would say, well, but look at the perfect competition Econ 101 model. There's no exploitation there. You have the marginal product of the worker, that's the value of the worker to the firm, and you have the wage that the firm pays the worker. And in perfect competition, they're in rough accordance or in total accordance. So there is no unequal exchange there. And also there are loads of buyers and sellers of labor power. So what's the deal? Who's in a vulnerable position? And I agree, of course, as the model stands, yeah, sure, that goes. But in actuality, I can imagine, and we have many economic models that show that, I can imagine various sources of vulnerabilities. So you have the oligopsony model, you have the monopsonistic competition model. In extreme cases, you have the monopsony model, which all relax the assumption of perfect competition. So they introduce, for example, a condition where you have a few a small number of large employers, large firms, and competition is curtailed somewhat because of market concentration in such conditions. But okay, that usually doesn't happen in labor markets. So what else? Well, you have, for example, a search cost and frictions. So workers sometimes see it as costly to try to inform themselves of their outside options of employment, and maybe they're exploited right now at their current employer, and they know that they're exploited, but they don't want to move to somebody else who would offer them a higher wage simply because they don't want to inform themselves of that alternative. Or you have, let's just say, heterogeneous preferences. Some workers are so attached for emotional reasons to their workplace or for non-pecuniary benefits that they get that they tolerate an amount of exploitation and they don't switch jobs so that their marginal product would get in line with the wage. And when we look at empirical estimates, we see that on average, this is data coming from the United States, on average, a worker is exploited to the tune of 15 to 20%. So there's a 15 to 20% discrepancy between the marginal product and the wage. And you can measure that in a variety of ways. First of all, you can look at labor supply elasticities, try to calculate them from exit rates and application rates, and you see that elasticities come out to be something like 3.5, 4.5, which implies a 15 to 20% mismatch between the marginal product and the wage. You can look at sudden deaths of workers. When workers suddenly die and they're not replaced yet, you can look at what happens with firm revenue and cost, and you see that firm revenue declines by a more substantial amount than the marginal firm cost, which implies that there was a discrepancy going on. You can look, lastly, let me just mention one last thing. You can look at market concentration, which does not necessarily imply reduced competition, but it might. And you can look at, we have evidence both from Europe and from United States, and what we see is that more highly concentrated industries, when you try to control for everything other that's relevant, in comparison to industries that are not as highly concentrated, you see higher wage markdowns. So higher wage markdowns in more highly concentrated industries, which implies that there's probably not all that much competition. And so there's some exploitation, some discrepancy between the marginal product of the worker and the wage.
Does this concept of exploitation, can it apply just as well to other non-wage prices, like just a consumer buying something? And are there other areas of the economy or prices where similar discrepancies like that come up?
Sure, yeah. So what happens is you can look at price markups. One classical economic thought was that maybe more highly concentrated industries that were ostensibly of a lesser competitive nature, maybe customers are getting fleeced because these semi-quasi monopolists or oligopolists can charge higher prices. So prices for goods that are higher than the marginal cost to the firm of producing that product. And funnily enough, what you see from these same empirical studies that I've been summarizing now is that in more highly concentrated industries, you do see wage markdowns, so exploitation of workers, but you don't see high price markups. So it doesn't seem that customers are getting ripped off.
Okay, so then this might be happening under capitalism, but a relevant question is, compared to what? What's the alternative? And do similar types of exploitation happen in less capitalist, non-market, traditional, socialist, or whatever other types of economies?
Yeah, definitely. You definitely saw that. So in feudalism, the rate of exploitation was much, much higher than in capitalism. It's hard to even measure that. But if you use some proxies, you see that the average peasant was exploited to the tune of 40 to 50% or even more at certain periods. And if the average worker in the United States, for example, is exploited to the tune of 15%, that's a big difference. And of course, we all know what happened in really existing socialist societies in Soviet Union, to an extent in Yugoslavia, of which Slovenia, my country, was once a part of. You saw great exploitation of workers. And maybe even if workers were not all that exploited, in the sense that their marginal product, if you can even talk about the marginal product of the worker in a planned economy, but that their marginal product was not in that much of a discrepancy with the wage that the worker received, maybe not, but the fact that these countries had low living standards, the fact that the shelves in stores were empty, the fact that they were beset by all these problems of production and distribution, all of that, I think, should lead us to the conclusion that really existing capitalism definitely beats out really existing socialism or really existing feudalism. And even analytical Marxists, like the ones I've mentioned, Eric Olin Wright and people like that, all say, of course, planned economies, Soviet Union, or whatever we've tried when it comes to socialism in the past, all of that is much worse on net, on balance, in comparison to real world capitalism.
And that might be the case even if capitalism exploited workers more than socialism did. If the trade-off with, say, very much higher rates of growth or higher wages, because even under this way of thinking about exploitation, as you said, it's still a positive-sum game. It's still, like, the exploited workers are still benefiting compared to not being. If you have an exploitative job, you're better off than if you don't have that job at all. It just would be better still if you weren't exploited in this way, or if you were getting paid closer to your marginal productivity. But it still might be worth it, even if under socialism there were no exploitation, but the wages were dramatically lower, the growth was lower, or something like that. Maybe it wouldn't be, but that trade-off is possible under this way of thinking about exploitation.
Absolutely. The living standards I'm talking about the data coming from the US now, the living standards for the average blue collar worker have risen 20-fold since the Industrial Revolution. So even though they're exploited to an extent on my account, that doesn't mean that, first of all, their living standards have declined or that they've risen just barely. Definitely not. Yeah.
Okay. Your basic thesis here about exploitation is that workers are exploited under capitalism, but probably not as much as people think. And capitalism itself has actually reduced a lot of exploitation. So the exploitation that remains is probably not distinctively capitalist. It's maybe a ubiquitous feature of economic activity or something like that, or whatever. And capitalism fixes a lot of it, but not all of it.
Exactly. So what I think my Marxist and socialist friends miss out, and what I missed years ago, is that competition, market competition, when we are talking about labor markets, market competition is actually beneficial to the workers. Not just because it increases their outside options, but because there's this Econ 101 perfect competition story that you can tell. Chris Fryman sometimes says that if you had a auction and a $10 bill were being auctioned off, and people were bidding for that $10 bill, somebody would maybe offer $5 at first, but somebody else would then have a profit opportunity and would offer 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, all the way until you reach the same value that the dollar that you're getting, that you're paying for, equals the dollar amount that you're giving away. And if you just replace this simple story with workers and employers, if there's perfect competition and somebody is being exploited, employers would have a profit opportunity to employ that exploited worker by trying to bid up his wage to lure him away from the first employer. So if the first employer is employing somebody at $1 an hour and the worker is actually bringing in $5 an hour, so he's being exploited at the rate of $4 an hour, 5 minus 1. The second employer would then pay him $2 to get him to move from the first employer to the second one, and the second employer would still benefit because 5 minus 2 is 3, and then the third employer would also do that, and at the end the wage would equilibrate at around the marginal product. So competition helps workers. And when you said that the remaining exploitation right now on capitalist markets is maybe non-capitalist in nature, yeah, I think that could be it. So it's non-capitalist in nature because it's produced by market concentration, because there's not enough competition when it comes to some labor markets. And when the issue are heterogeneous preferences and the search and cost frictions that workers have when switching jobs, then that's also a feature of, I would say, the human condition, that you have these search costs and frictions, not of capitalism specifically. Yeah.
Hey everyone, this is Chris Kaufman, and I just wanted to take a break to thank you all from the bottom of my heart for listening to these episodes and giving me the opportunity to speak with people I admire and read amazing books every week, every other week, whatever. If you are interested in helping this little engine that could of a show grow, please just recommend it to a friend. Recommend it to a friend. Maybe give it a 5-star rating on one of those places you listen to it at. But really, if you just recommend it to someone, that goes a long way for a small show like this. So thank you again. Thank you for listening. Keep listening. And back to the show. Let's talk about inequality. So my reading of the book is that probably of all of the potential weaknesses you bring up of capitalism, do you think that this is the strongest one, or maybe the one that's most distinctively capitalist, or is that close to right? Or what do you want to say about inequality?
Yeah, you're right. I think I do. So with inequality, you have income inequality and you have wealth inequality, and you can measure it in different ways. You have within country inequality, between country inequality, global inequality. You have to keep all of those apart because the trend lines don't always go together. And when some politicians just say inequality without the adjective income or wealth, or distinguishing between all these measures, saying inequalities have been rising for the past 40 years and have never been as high as today. Well, what are you talking about? Which parts of the world, which types of inequality, which measures? Because they just crisscross some of them. So inequality is a complex topic, but in general, I would say that the worry of most people today is that under capitalism, even if people are not exploited to a substantial degree, even if their living standards are rising, there's still inequality, and maybe even still rising inequality. Or even if inequality is not rising, it's still an ineradicable feature of capitalism. And isn't that problematic in a way? I would say that on first glance, it's not problematic. The economist Deirdre McCloskey comes to mind in her critique of Thomas Piketty. She says, look, man, what are you worrying about? Everybody is better off today than they were 20 years ago. So it's not like that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. No, the rich are getting richer and the poor are also getting richer, but at a slower pace. So why worry about inequality? You're just worrying about a vague feeling of envy. And I would say, well, maybe, but not really. If you look at various correlations I go over in the book, you see that inequality, for various reasons, simply correlates and sometimes even in a causal manner, correlates with various social problems like reduced social trust, like increased homicide rates, like certain health problems, obesity, for example. And then it's hard to tease out whether this is just correlation or there's something causal going on. But in some cases, we have firm evidence that something causal is going on. And it's interesting to ask, well, why? How come just a difference between income between various people would cause obesity? Well, yeah, it's a hard story to sell, but the raw correlations do point in that direction. And then maybe if you just move on a theoretical level and think of it from a rational choice perspective, I think you have something to worry about. If you are, as a libertarian, concerned with rent seeking, for example, and the regulatory capture, you can understand quite simply how if some people, the elites, are getting more and more of economic resources in such a way that it outpaces, the rate of growth outpaces the rate of growth of economic resources for all the other ordinary groups of people in a society, well, that could be then transformed. Those economic resources could be used to gain an outsized influence in the political sphere, to bribe politicians, to make mutually advantageous deals with them, and to simply capture their regulatory machinery. Now, of course, a libertarian would say, well, we have to do away with the government, and we both know that this is not really feasible. So in currently existing a mixed economy where you have a large government sector and a large private market, I think even libertarians would have to worry to an extent about inequalities simply because of the problem of an increased opportunity to rent seek in unequal society, because the ordinary people don't have the same amount of resources with which they could counter the outsized influence that the rich have, for example.
And to be clear, when we're talking about the correlations between inequality and these other unattractive features of society, are the main correlations about particularly high levels of inequality, not about societies that just say diverge from egalitarianism, which doesn't really exist anywhere?
Yeah, it's both. It's both. So there are some threshold effects. Only after you reach a Gini level on a scale from 0 to 100, a Gini is a measure of inequality. After a Gini of 35 or 40, America, the United States, is currently at a Gini of 40 to 41 after taxes. And Slovenia, for example, is at a Gini of 25. Sweden is around 29. The OECD average, I think, is 31. So America, the United States, is an outlier here. And when you get to the US levels of inequality, you get to see some quite bad effects. But below that level, sometimes nothing bad happens. But other times, even below that level, you do have some correlations pointing in the wrong direction, even there.
So I don't know if this is actually empirically the case, but sometimes I worry about the inequality measures inadvertently penalizing what, even from a left-wing perspective, you would think of as an attractive feature of a society. Namely, if you're a wealthy society that has a lot of immigration, isn't that going to hurt your measures of inequality? And the United States, even though there's plenty of controversy around it, tends to have quite a bit of immigration, usually from much poorer countries. So you might have a situation where poor immigrants come to the United States, make themselves dramatically better off than they were, but they're still, on average, significantly poorer than even poor Americans, and create a situation where American inequality goes up, even though everybody should be cheering on this event. Well, I guess one, do these measures of inequality ever control for rates of immigration, first of all, and or are there features like that or other kinds of things that tend to drive up measures of inequality?
There's definitely something to that. That's a good comment. And no, the studies typically don't control for that. You just get the raw inequality data. And when people, like you said, interpret that raw inequality as straightforwardly bad, yeah, I don't think that's the case. Especially in some outlier countries like the United States, I think there is a causal role or explanatory role to play for these high levels of inequality that has to do with semi-open borders and migration. I mean, the United States doesn't have open borders. Brennan and Kaplan would be aghast, but yeah, of course.
But even relative to a lot of other countries, they still have more immigration.
Absolutely, and historically, they definitely had so in the 20th century. So you're right. I'll have to think more about that. That's an interesting question. I haven't really thought about that before.
And then you mentioned the particular mechanism of how, like, there's this question, okay, how does inequality turn itself into social instability and other, or obesity or whatever other kinds of problems. You mentioned one mechanism, which was the only one I remembered reading that like gelled in my head. I can absolutely see how that version of high levels of material inequality could lead to social inability. Basically, if you have a small group of very wealthy elites who are substantially more wealthy than other people, they're going to have a better time basically outbidding others on, buying power and then using that power. So it's like the inequality is an indirect means towards achieving more raw forms of power. And are there other plausible mechanisms for how inequality turns into social instability or other unattractive things that you find plausible?
Yeah, I think so. When it comes to social trust, for example, I can imagine social trust being eroded in a social environment with high levels of income and wealth inequality. And maybe Deirdre McCloskey would call that envy and would say that if we are adult, rational, enlightened people, we shouldn't be envious. Okay, sure, but it is an ineradicable feature of human nature that we compare ourselves to others. And when people compare themselves to others and see that some other people have it much better than they themselves do, I would say that even if absolute living standards are okay for everybody, that is going to be a problem for social trust, for social cooperation. People will be angry at each other. People will be envious. So I can see that as a direct mechanism of inequality eroding trust.
Can you say something about measures of capitalism? You, in this book, lean into basically measures of economic freedom, I think, as one, a useful empirical measure and a more fine-grained measure of how capitalist a society is. It doesn't fall into this trap of just saying like you're capitalist and you're not capitalist. There's degrees of capitalism. What do you think are the most relevant measures empirically, and what are the concerns with those measures?
Yeah, I think the economic freedom indexes are the best we have currently. Some people, and I do that as well, proxy capitalism by looking at GDP per capita, and you would just simply say that the more wealthy a country is, the more capitalist it is, but there are problems with that. But indexes of economic freedom actually measure economic and political, but more economic institutions in a society. And if we define, like we did at the beginning of our talk, capitalism as a set of economic institutions, well, that's a straightforward measure then. And you have various institutes like the Fraser Institute and the Heritage Foundation that construct these measures of economic freedom, and you can have some quibbles with them. Usually I'm wary of the Heritage Foundation because, if I'm not mistaken, they use subjective measures of economic freedom. I mean, everybody does that, but they do that measure in-house. So they pick their own experts, and these experts of the Heritage Foundation then measure the economic freedom of a country based on their own, of course, political prejudices and biases, while the Fraser Institute prides itself on using third-party data, so data from the World Bank and the IMF, which of course relies on subjective measures to a large part, but those institutions are less obviously libertarian, while the Heritage Foundation and Fraser obviously are more libertarian. So the Fraser Institute's index then has 5 categories: size of government, legal system and property rights, regulation, freedom of international trade, and sound money. And all of those 5 main categories that make up the total economic freedom score of a country in a particular year can get broken down in various subcomponents. I think the property rights and legal system component has 8 subcomponents, like reliability of police, security of property rights, the independence of the judiciary, lack of corruption, and so on. And you can then in various ways pick at those measures. For example, one critique of them coming from a Marxist perspective was definitional, not really having any qualms with the way that various components are measured, but simply Ben Burgess, a socialist philosopher, was writing, I think, a year ago in the Jacobin magazine, and he was critiquing Jason Brennan and Peter Leeson because they, in a couple of articles, used these economic freedom indexes cases to try to show that they correlate positively with various desirable social outcomes. And then they concluded that capitalism seems to go hand in hand, even though you can't say that it's been causally responsible for various positive social outcomes. And Burgess, in his critique, says, wait a minute, even definitionally, even if you accept the external validity of these concepts, definitionally, various subcomponents of the legal system, like the reliability of police and the independence of the judiciary, have nothing to do with capitalism conceptually, definitionally. So you get spurious results, he claims. You basically look at countries that have a strong legal system and that have also good social outcomes, and then you claim victory for capitalism. And he says that that is unfair because even in a non-capitalist system, not in the Soviet Union, but in a non-capitalist system, allegedly in the future, you would try to take care of the institutions of police and the judicial process. And so if there is a lack of corruption in a future socialist system, is that really a measure of capitalism? And in the book, I say, okay, sure, there are some problems with that critique conceptually, but maybe let's take that on board. And then I try to recalculate the economic freedom scores for various countries in the year 2019 in line with Burgess's critique. And I then try to see if the existing correlations to which Leeson and Brennan referred to, if they stand up to such a redefinition or recalculation. And in the book, I show with scatter plots and basic correlations that basically nothing changes. There is some movement from the first quartile of economic freedom to the second, and from the first to the third, but most countries in the first and the fourth quartile stay where they were, and the correlations are just as strong as if you include all of those measures of the judicial system and corruption and so on. So I think that critique, for example, doesn't hold water.
You drop all of the measures and submeasures that are not very obviously linked to a solid definition of capitalism. Yeah, like you said, like independent judiciary, strength of police, and there are other ones too. And just end up sticking with basically like strong property rights and low regulation and things like that.
Yeah.
Free trade.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense to me. And for what it's worth, I've had similar thoughts about those measures. That are they including outcome measures rather than input measures in what counts as capitalism?
Yeah.
But maybe free markets and property rights cause rule of law in other ways, or an independent judiciary.
Yeah, sure.
In that way, I'm not sure what would be a capitalist measure of those things. Or maybe you don't need to measure those things in terms of capitalism. I mean,
I wouldn't measure them. I wouldn't measure them in terms of capitalism. Yeah.
So you've got several other chapters on interesting topics that we won't get into for considerations of time. You'll have to read the book. You talk about the relationship between capitalism and general social morality, trust and levels of violence. And there's a lot of fascinating research on basically suggesting that, exposure to markets and more capitalist societies tends to actually increase things like social trust and trustworthiness and other kinds of what most people would consider moral behavior. And that comes as a surprise to a lot of people, I think, who aren't familiar with that literature. It was a surprise to me, even as a pro-capitalist person. I wouldn't have expected there to be much of any correlation there one way or the other. Retroactively, it somewhat makes sense to me that consistent exposure to strangers in a positive way might make you more trusting of people you don't know, whereas otherwise you might only be generally trusting of people you have close personal knowledge of. The market is a lot of exposure that you wouldn't otherwise have to working and cooperating with people you don't have personal relationships with. You also have the ending chapter of capitalism and the environment, another big topic. Do you want to say something before we start signing off? Say something briefly about you kind of come to the conclusion that capitalism good, mostly good. You don't come down on a very strongly like libertarian ideological pure free market perspective. Probably the best form of capitalism is capitalism with like some kind of decent social safety net and welfare state, maybe like Nordic model, a little bit more capitalist than typical Nordic model countries, but keeping the generous social welfare state. Is that a fair assessment of where you come down in this book?
That's perfect, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to maybe conclude the talk on this topic. Yeah, exactly. What I show, and this is interspersed in the book on various pages, but I don't ever mention it explicitly, or I don't have a chapter dedicated to that issue. But I basically come down politically, normatively on the side of social democratic capitalism. Some people have called it a free market welfare states, and like you say, yeah, that's basically Denmark. Maybe not even Sweden, because Sweden is notably less capitalist than Denmark. Both of them are very capitalist, much more so than Bernie Sanders or somebody like him would say. But Denmark, I think, or maybe Norway, are really examples of countries that have robust capitalist institutions, very modest regulation of businesses, a strong labor market institutions, strong trade unions, a centralized collective bargaining. Sure, I think that would be something that some libertarians would not like too much, but otherwise exceptionally free free international trade, exceptionally strong private property rights, and then of course, yeah, lastly, quite a large size of government. So lots of taxation, lots of government spending, and lots of redistribution. But that would be, I think, a marriage of the best aspects of capitalism and competition and markets and the price mechanism and free international trade. The only thing they're missing are open borders. And then on the other hand, I think the positive aspects of government. And don't be afraid, I'm aware of all the faults and weaknesses of governments. You mentioned my first book, Rational Choice and Democratic Government. I'll go over the public choice theoretical literature over there. I talk about government failures. They happen in Denmark, definitely. But even government failures don't all come in the same flavor. Having a government like the one in Denmark is quite different than having a government that we have here in Slovenia, or you have in the United States, or of course people have in Zimbabwe or Afghanistan. So not all government is made the same.
In my head, there's a model of what I regard as the strongest threat to my worldview. Threat's a bad word. It's not a threat. I'm a libertarian. I'm a relatively strong libertarian. I suspect that an ideal social arrangement would be very, very laissez-faire, maybe even market anarchism. But the social system that I see as having like the strongest case against that, or that I feel like I argue with in my head the most, is something like what you just laid out, or what I've called in my head Nordic libertarianism, and that's the image I have, is basically like extremely free markets in always very strong private property rights, but with a modest but still relatively generous social safety net that is, market oriented in some ways and somewhat means tested. Something like Denmark is usually the country I have in mind, like an extremized version of Denmark, more free market, but keeping their social safety net. So it was cool to read this book, a very thoughtful presentation of, even though that wasn't like your main point to defend that vision, that comes through a bit, and I enjoyed reading about that.
Thanks, Chris, and that makes total sense. Maybe just one last recommendation. You could read Lane Canworthy's book. Lane Canworthy is a political scientist based out of, I think, California, where you're at. And he has a book called Social Democratic Capitalism. It was out from Oxford University Press, I think, in 2019. So Lane Canworthy, Social Democratic Capitalism. He also deals with libertarian objections in what I think is a fair way, and he himself is no Marxist or socialist. He also has a book, Would Democratic Socialism Be Better? And he says, no, it wouldn't. So maybe you would like that book.
I'll check it out for sure. I'll let that recommendation stand, but I usually ask for a recommendation. Do you have any other book recommendations that you want to give that would complement this work particularly well?
Yeah, I think those two books would be it. So Social Democratic Capitalism and Would Democratic Socialism Be Better by Lane Canworthy. And maybe, but this is now from a more libertarian perspective, Van der Vossen and Jason Brennan, their book In Defense of Openness, I think is also quite nice from a more philosophical perspective.
Great. I'm going to include those and other works we've discussed that have come up so far on the show notes. Are you working on any other upcoming projects that people should know about at the moment?
I'm working on a couple of articles about the democratic recession. So this phenomenon of declining democracy scores all over the world in established democracies, in fledgling democracies, even in autocracies, measures of civil rights and political rights. This has been declining after the efflorescence, after the boom in the late 20th century. Now, for at least 15 years, it went hand in hand with the rise of illiberal populism of the likes of Trump and Bolsonaro and people like that. And I'm trying to see whether the rise in economic freedom over that period, the past 15 years, has contributed to that. And my preliminary findings have been that no, there is a positive association trying to control in all various ways for everything else that's relevant. There's been a positive correlation between increases in economic freedom and increases where they happen in democracy, or in some of my regressions, there has been a neutral relationship, so a null finding, but no clear negative correlation. So in that sense, I try to answer some of my colleagues' critiques and complaints that the rise of neoliberalism, which is what they call economic freedom, the rise of neoliberalism in the past 15 years has dismantled democracy, which has a surface level appearance, a surface level attraction. But I try to show empirically that this is not the case, and this research will be coming out over the next year or so, something like that.
I look forward to it. Where can people find you if they want to keep up with your ongoing projects?
My personal profile is only on Facebook. If they search for my name, I'm not on Twitter, but I do have a ResearchGate profile. Again, just search my name. All of my research is usually available over there.
Okay, great. I'll include a link there and to your author page on Amazon as well. My guest once again has been Tibor Rutar, and his book is Capitalism for Realists, Virtues and Vices of the Modern Economy. Tibor, thank you for joining me on Ideas Having Sex.
It was amazing. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you for listening to Ideas Having Sex, where we have stimulating conversations on social science, philosophy, history, politics, and more. If you're a fan of what I do, please take a minute to subscribe to the show and to give us a rating and review wherever you listen. I'm Chris Kaufman. Thanks for listening.